Well, hi, friends. We're so excited that you're here and that you could join us for today's webinar, Youth Mental Health After the Pandemic. And we're going to be joined with Dakota Family Services social workers, Christy, Wilkie, and Lucas Mitzel. This webinar is part of a free monthly learning series presented by Dakota Medical Foundation, Level Up Fargo, and Maddo Foundation. And together we are working to delay, decrease, and defeat substance abuse and addiction. So whether if you're a parent, a teacher, a coach, a mentor, or a caring adult, this series is for you. So be sure to follow us on social media channels for upcoming webinar announcements. And so, again, I'm just so excited about today's special guests, and I can't wait to introduce you to both of them now. And starting with Christy Wilkie, she's a licensed clinical social worker and therapist. She provides outpatient therapy for children and adolescents ages 5 to 25. She has 21 years of experience working with children and family, and Christy earned her master's degree in social work from Indiana University, Purdue University. Christy is married and loves music, adventures, golfing, and the Vikings. So it is an honor to welcome you, Christy, to today's show. Also, we've got with us Lucas Mitzel. Lucas is a licensed clinical social worker and therapist that specializes in outpatient therapy for children and adolescents and adults ages 5 to 30. He earned his master's degree in social work from the University of North Dakota. And besides being a husband and a father, Lucas is a musician, dog lover, Star Wars fanatic, and Vikings fan. Christy and Lucas, welcome. We're so glad to have you on today's show.
Thank you for having us.
Cool.
Well, I know you two have gotten this topic a lot, asking about what are the impacts to youth from this pandemic. And so maybe let's just start. Could you tell us what's the status of youth mental health right now?
We're struggling. Ever since the pandemic hit, anxiety's gotten worse, depression's gotten worse. Really just everything has just gotten worse. Some research has shown that during the quarantine, diagnoses of anxiety were 3 times worse than before. Depression was 4 times worse. And that's not even talking about the trauma that came with the quarantine, with the pandemic. So people are just struggling right now.
And in addition to that, and probably because of that, substance abuse has gone through the roof as well. We've seen increases in people struggling with alcoholism, drugs, partly out of boredom, partly out of trying to medicate the feelings of anxiety and depression that they've had. I'd read one study that said that 75% of people right now are reporting symptoms of depression and or anxiety due to the pandemic. And we've seen that come through in our referrals and with kids. I think the really cool thing about the pandemic in general, if there is a cool thing about the pandemic, we're really reaching here. But it's that there's been a focus on mental health. There's been a focus on how are you? Are you taking care of yourself? What are you doing to take care of yourself? And I think because of that, it's given people an opportunity to seek out services when they maybe wouldn't have before because they would have been ashamed or embarrassed. And the pandemic has kind of given people a reason to be, well, yeah, I mean, 2020, man, let's get into therapy. Totally, totally cool. So that's been kind of nice to see. But we have a lot of referrals and people are struggling.
Well, and Christy, you and Lucas both work with a pretty wide range, 5 up to 25 to 30. Any differences in those, real younger kids versus teenagers, and kind of how's it unfolding for those segments of our youth population?
Yeah, I think kids are like sponges, and the little ones especially, they take in more than you think that they do. And so what I'm seeing in a lot of little kids, because they don't necessarily understand a lot of what's going on, is that they are mirroring what they're hearing from their parents or from the adults in their lives or from the teachers in their lives. And as much as adults want to try to keep that anxiety and the depression and the feeling of being so overwhelmed away from their kids, it's kind of having the opposite effect where kids are like trying to keep it together and trying to figure things out. And so I've talked to a lot of parents about being transparent about how they're feeling with their kids and role modeling an expression of emotion. And as you get older, and they have a better understanding of it, you're looking at a lot of grief that's coming with the pandemic and loss and things that kids haven't been able to do. Like last year, even a lot of those seniors didn't get prom, they didn't get graduation, they didn't get sports seasons, and a lot of their identities are wrapped up in that. And so it was like, who am I in the absence of this thing that I am, in the absence of being a baseball player, in the absence of being a golfer? What does my identity even look like? And even now, even though we've made a lot of progress towards, opening things up and loosening restrictions, there's still this feeling of loss with this graduating class that I'm seeing, that they don't get to have a school prank, or they don't get to do the sidewalk chalk that they normally get to do, or everything just kind of looks different, and they're just kind of bummed out about it. And it's a time that they can't get back, and how to help them make sense of that is difficult.
Well, and Lucas, to you, so, from, in addition to, age ranges, what have you kind of seen when this thing started, and now that restrictions are loosening and we're starting to see things open up, what's the status of youth mental health right now and at the beginning?
Yeah, so things have kind of evolved since the very beginning. At the very beginning, we're telling there's this magical thing called coronavirus that's coming our way, and everybody's saying, it's fine, everything's gonna be okay. We don't need to worry about it. Don't freak out. People are overreacting. And then March comes, and we're not fine. And people are freaking out. Anxiety is really high. We're telling kids that they need to wear these masks, but don't worry, because you're not going to die. It's not affecting you. And so then it transformed into kids are worried about their grandparents because it's going to affect their grandparents. And then they're worried about, I'm going to get my grandpa sick, and I'm going to hurt them. And then as we went through the summer, we had our very first major holiday of July 4th. And that was brand new, of like, how do we do these traditions that we've always done with wearing masks, or we're not even supposed to go anywhere. For a while, there was a no travel, like you're not supposed to like cross state lines there for a little bit. And, some people are breaking that, and that was making kids stressed out. And it's been a roller coaster. And then when you go into the fall, when school starts, there was a little bit of indifference. Like kids were kind of over it, like we all were, but almost like whatever, it's fine. And a lot of schools were having some troubles with masks and stuff, more with the older kids. Elementary school kids did amazing. They shocked everyone. But it's been a roller coaster. It's been quite a ride.
I think too, when you talk about the course of the pandemic, especially in regard to mental health, you looked at the beginning in March, and I run, so I go through lots of neighborhoods, and there was sidewalk chalk, and we can get through this, and we can do it. And there's all this uplifting, encouraging stuff like, we just get to be with our families for a little bit. And I think at that point, everybody thought it was going to end, and then it didn't end. And so you find yourself in kind of this constant traumatic state, that kind of went from, yay, we can do it, to, oh my God, is it still 2020? and you kind of lost that sense of, community and togetherness, and everyone. And then it became more divisive, whether people were supporting masks or not supporting masks. And so even that has an impact on people's mental health.
Right. And if you look at 2020 as a whole, not even just looking at coronavirus, there was a lot of stuff that happened. I mean, we started the year with Kobe Bryant and that tragic accident. And that really primed kids. I mean, he was a hero for kids. That really primed kids to talk about death and their own mortality. And then this virus hit, and family members are dying, and friends are dying, and friends of friends are dying. And then we have protests going on, and more people are dying and getting hurt. And so this, not only has this been causing anxiety, but it's been causing trauma for people. And we really have no idea the lasting impact that this is going to have. I think we're going to be picking up the pieces of this for years to come.
And the other part, with all of the grief and the loss and everything that's been going on, life didn't stop. There's pandemic related stuff, but then there's just day-to-day stuff that would happen in a normal year that was stressful. And what people were finding is that everybody was maxed out. Everybody was overwhelmed. And so when something tragic happened to them, their support system was already kind of maxed out. And so they weren't receiving the support that they normally would in a non-pandemic year. because everybody was kind of tapped out. And so and then there's some resentment that comes from that when people aren't able to be there. And even though in your brain you can rationalize why people couldn't be there or why they didn't offer the same support that they would normally offer, there's still some hurt and resentment that comes from feeling like nobody was there for me when this really crappy thing happened. And that's tough.
Well, and you two have done such a wonderful job of laying out the status of what how this started, what youth are feeling and how they're going to process it. And Lucas, you mentioned, the impact of this, who knows how long the impact is going to be. So sort of switching to, what are some of the staple things that we can do as adults to make a difference for youth mental health? So for parents and coaches, and we're concerned about how this pandemic has and will impact youth, what are some of the core things that we can do about it?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we need to continue to do is have conversations about mental health. One of the, like Christy said, one of the best things that came out of the virus was the talk and opening up the conversation about mental health. And we can't stop doing that. That's something that we needed that way before coronavirus hit us, and we need to keep doing that. And having conversations with kids, opening up those conversations so that they feel comfortable talking when these things are happening, coming up to adults, and just like we want them to be comfortable when they feel sick to their stomach or something, or they have a headache, we want them to talk about when they're feeling sad or when they're feeling worried. And then it's really important for parents to open up about those things too. And I'm not saying share your deepest, darkest secrets with your children, but like, this was hard for me too, buddy. Like, I feel sad too that I can't go see grandma and grandpa. I feel sad, or I'm worried about what's going to happen tomorrow too. But we're going to get through it, and this is what we can do, and focusing on what we have power over. So validating and then finding solutions, or being more solution focused, can be really helpful. But bottom line is opening up those conversations about mental health and just how we're doing is really the biggest thing that I think we can do.
The other things that are important, I kind of look at things as like a balance. And so one is trying to find ways to reduce stress for kids. Have a talk. What are the things that are making them anxious? What are the things that are stressing them out? And finding creative ways to remove those sources of stress, whether that's a lot of stress is around school right now with kids and feeling overwhelmed with the amount of work and getting it done in a platform that they've never used before, and some people getting things done and that other kids aren't, and really sitting down with your kid and figuring out what's the best way to get through this school stuff that we have to get through without it being a source of stress. How can we do that? Hanging out with their friends, finding ways to connect. And now, like with restrictions being loosened, even little kids are having a hard time understanding that it's okay to be with people. And so it's kind of like a mind shift in that way, because we've been telling them for a year and some change now, don't be around people, don't hug, keep your mask on, do all that. And so now we're kind of trying to get them back into like, let's find ways that you can connect with your friends. Let's find ways that you can connect with grandma and grandpa. I have a kid that's going to see his grandma for the first time in a year and a half this weekend. And it's just the positive impact that's had on his mental health is outrageous. The other part of reducing the stress is also finding ways to strengthen skill sets. What are the skills that we can do to help you manage your emotions, to help you communicate what you're feeling? Even sitting down with kids and going through simple emotions, how they feel, when they felt them before. If you think about stress, even as adults, at least for me, I know this might be a shocker, but I've become a little forgetful when I'm in super stressful situations. And a pandemic's no different. It's just being in a state of heightened arousal, we call it in the brain, for a really, really long time. And so even for adults, think of the things that help you organize your life and put that together, and think of how you can make a child-sized version of that for your kids. Checklists, text reminders, alarms, all of those kinds of things that just kind of help you organize your brain in a way that it helps make sense to you. Those are all things that are super important, as well as realizing that kids are still hitting developmental stages, even in a pandemic, and to not forget to do the stuff you would just normally do. I think there's been this idea for parents, especially, that they should be doing something more because we're in a pandemic. Like, what more do I have to be doing? Instead of realizing that you still love on your kids, you still, you hit their developmental milestones, you still get them walking, you still do all the things you normally would, and that should be celebrated too. like doing normal things you would normally do is super important, and people kind of feel like they should be doing more, and then that causes people to feel guilty and bad about themselves, and it's just not necessary.
Well, and Lucas, back to you. Thoughts of other things that you've seen be really effective. I mean, if we open up the conversations, we show some modeling about what these feelings are. We do the things that Christy is talking about. We give ourselves a little bit of forgiveness. It sounds like some additional things that you have found useful for parents and coaches and adults to be supportive.
Yeah, I think we saw this a lot, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, but there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so providing education as to what is actually happening and how things actually work, that's been really helpful for a lot of my kids, because they don't really understand what it is, or they go on YouTube and they watch their favorite YouTube person talking to them about whether it be mental health or the virus or whatever's going on in the world. And then they have all this weird information and they don't know where to put it. And a lot of it could be just false or misleading. And so providing education is a really good way. Another thing, especially with kids who are anxious, is finding ways to give them control over the situation. So a lot of, classic example that I like to share is kid doesn't want to wear pants because they're trying to find control over something. And so we need him to wear pants. And instead of fighting over whether or not he wears pants, you can pick which pants you want. Do you want the red pants or the blue pants? And now all of a sudden they feel like they have a choice and they have control over something, and they pick the pants. We don't care which color, just that they wear pants. And so if you can find creative ways to give kids a sense of control in the midst of losing it all, that can help them feel better just about things that are going on, and just overall just feel calm when the whole world just seems to be falling apart around them.
I think the other really important thing is to remember that if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you're a coach, whatever, a pastor, aunt, uncle, whatever, and you know those kids in your life better than anybody else. And if you can see that something's wrong, don't be afraid to open up a conversation and say, hey, you seem a little off today. Like, what's up with that? In a very understanding way, instead of being like, God, you're crabby, get over it, snap out of it. We have a tendency to tell kids to stop, don't, can't, shouldn't, instead of opening up a conversation to say, hey, you look like you're pretty mad today. What's up with that? What's happening? That we can just have a conversation. And that's super important, because kids have to learn that emotions aren't bad. And a lot of times that's the message they get when they're, throwing things or punching you or biting you. And it's frustrating because we have emotional responses. It's like, stop biting me, stop hitting things. Instead of, kind of taking a step back and going, okay, behaviors are typically an expression of an emotion that's being felt. Kids don't like to be bad. Kids don't want to do mean things. And so to say, hey, don't talk to kids when they're angry. That doesn't work. But when they're calmed down and say, hey, what's up with that? What's going on? Let's talk about that. That's huge for kids to have an avenue to have somebody that they can talk to that's not going to judge them or punish them or take away their birthday, which would be terrible. And the other thing for schoolwork that, because I talk a lot about school because it really is frustrating for kids, especially with the back and forth in doing hybrid and then going distance learning and then going full time. And their whole world was a little off. But giving kids homework in small amounts is important. Instead of saying, this is your packet of homework for the week that we got off of, whatever school learning platform they're doing. Saying, you know what, we're going to do these 5 problems and then do another 5 problems instead of giving them all at one time. That's really frustrating. School drop-offs are another big thing that we've had a problem with, more so I think this year than other years. And there are always some kids, but this year a lot of kids are like, if I can learn from home, why do I have to go to school? That's dumb. I would rather just stay home in my pajamas and not worry about pants, Lucas. And then so they can just stay at home. And so it's hard for them to wrap their brains around, why do I have to go to school? That brings me anxiety versus just doing it at home. And so pre-teaching to kids, this is what the schedule looks like tomorrow. This is what the schedule looks like, the day after. And so they have an idea of what's to come. Conversely, there's a lot of kids where school's their only safe place. And they didn't have that safe place for a long time. And so we saw, rates of abuse and neglect also go up. And so we've reached out to some teachers, and teachers have reached out to us for services for a lot of those kids, because there were a lot of families that were like, yeah, we get to be home, and that's a great place for everybody to be, but home isn't a great place for a lot of people to be, and sometimes those people fall through the cracks.
Well, and that it's difficult to think about all of the things that have happened and will happen because of this pandemic. But to highlight something positive that I think the both of you have shared is that perhaps this is an opportunity for some parenting and mentoring basics that maybe we weren't really good at, the fundamentals before. Having conversations about what's happening, discussing what your feelings are, breaking things into smaller bites so that you can get a sense of self-efficacy to accomplish things, making it, so that they have ability to have some control over their decisions. These are really practical things that you've given us that are not just for, when we're in an emergency, a psychological emergency, but all the time for us to be better parents, teachers, coaches. I think that's incredibly powerful for us. So as we continue to make our way through this pressure cooker, what are some of the things that you two think, we should be planning for the long term? Some checkpoints maybe that we should put in place, that, we have conversations at certain times, or routines. Can you walk us through a little bit of a sort of, as we continue to move out of the pandemic, what should we start planning for?
I think just overall, just you know your kids, and so if you start noticing any behavioral changes, anything that is different than the norm, that could be a cause for concern. And so that's a really broad thing to say because it's different for everybody. But an example could be if you start noticing that your child is really anxious, or maybe struggles when you separate from them. That could mean that there's something has been developing. A really big clue for parents has been sleep. Lots of people's sleep schedules was thrown off during the pandemic. Kids who are going to sleep at 3 in the morning, waking up at 6 in the morning. Kids who are trying to pull all-nighters for multiple days in a row. Or I was working with a little girl who just all of a sudden thought that somebody was going to break into her home, and was waking up multiple times during the night to make sure the doors were locked. And so this change was a clue, and then we sought out some help, got things figured out, and now we're better. And if people are isolating in their room, if people are not wanting to be around friends, or they quit their sports, or they don't want to go and be active anymore, or they start losing interest in other areas that they used to be interested in, these could all be warning signs of something bigger going on. If kids are giving away their things, if they're talking about suicide, if you notice a really big thing, especially for our Gen Zers, is they're really big into technology, and so we need to be monitoring their technology and just watching that, knowing what apps they're on, knowing what websites they're going on to, just so you have a heads up as to what they're doing, what they're involved in, who they're talking to. That can all provide you with forewarning or heads up that something might be going on.
I think too, when you look at any significant era, I guess, of life, there's trauma that comes along with it, and a lot of people don't think about living through a pandemic as trauma, but there are going to be triggers that come up for people that are going to bring them back to that time when their anxiety was high, or they felt more depressed. This is going to sound ridiculous, but like the smell of hand sanitizer is going to get to some people, and that's going to be a trigger for them to be like, and it brings all of those emotions back. And I think having the knowledge that living through a pandemic is traumatic, and allowing yourself to have those emotions and help, and reaching out to someone that can help you think through some of those are huge. There are different foods that people ate during the pandemic. There were different shows they watched. There were different, and all of those can be trauma triggers that will, for a long time, trigger people in a certain way. Even if you think of, 9/11, or you think of my grandparents, because I'm old now, but that lived through the Depression, right? They did things for their whole lives that had to do with living through the Depression. They saved ketchup packets. They became kind of hoardy. They did all sorts of weird things. And as a person now who's lived through a pandemic, those kinds of things make sense. We are washing our hands at abnormal rates, which is great. I love that we have gotten on this hand washing plan. But there are going to be triggers for people throughout their lives, probably, that will bring them back to the time when their anxiety and depression was heightened. And so to just be aware of that and to not judge yourself for having those feelings, and also to be like, Christy said that would happen, and that makes sense. Like, you're not going crazy. That's your body remembers trauma that your brain doesn't necessarily connect. And you feel that for a lot of things, but like smells, foods, shows, times of year, those are all going to be triggers going down, the road. And we have no idea what the long-term impact of this is going to be, but a lot of the research that's coming out is saying, years. This is going to be years of people finally being able to process through what they just went through. Because as humans, we just do what we have to do to get by. Especially as parents, you do what you have to do to get by while taking care of your children, and you just do it. Then you talk about grief, and it's hard to talk about any of this without talking about grief. But there's different kinds of grievers. There's people that are allowed to grieve during the time it's happening. Then there are people that will keep it together until everything is done and everything is taken care of, everything is fine, and then they allow themselves to grieve. And that's almost harder because the support that they had at the time was gone. And so people are reaching out and they're like, dude, we're over it. And some people are going to be like, I'm just looking at it. I'm just allowing myself to feel all the things I've been putting off for a really long time. And that's hard. So to just be aware of how you're feeling too, and to be able to reach out to somebody and get help if you're feeling like that's just way too overwhelming.
When you talk about those, notice that, a lot of wife and I cop documentary shows, is what I like to call them. And everything right now, all of the shows being played are all about coronavirus and what it was like in the middle of the pandemic during quarantine. And so even at the end of this, we were being re-exposed to everything that was traumatic to us and what that was like. The shows, like Grey's Anatomy, Good Doctor, Station 19, 911, like all of these really famous popular shows right now, they're all about this. And it's, of course, there's people dying. It's, how exhausted everybody was, how crabby everybody was at the time. And I noticed myself, like I'm getting uncomfortable while I'm watching this, and I get a little stiff. I maybe even get a little bit irritable because I'm being reminded of what it was all like back then, and as if it was like 10 years ago. But I'm being reminded of all of this and what that felt like, and it was hard. And so even right now, there's people are getting triggered again, and I think that that's going to continue to be a thing. I mean, you compare it to, I think, the last major, I'm not a history buff, so I apologize, I don't keep up with the news, but I think that the last major nation-changing event was 9/11. And I mean, just think of all the impact that has had since that occurred. This is gonna, I would not be shocked if this does something similar to that.
Even when you talk about there are people that are extroverted, and we're used to being in crowds. I'm a Vikings fan, season ticket holder, love being at US Bank Stadium. The thought of going to a stadium with 66,000 people right now is it makes me very anxious. And I think a lot of people will feel that going into like any place that's crowded, or restaurants, or any sort of concert or get together, or picnics, big group events, whatever it may be. There are going to be some people that have this like feeling that happens. It's just like, oh my gosh, a little bit of a panic moment. And it just really urge people to listen to what their body is saying. And maybe if you're feeling that, let's maybe back out of that and find smaller ways to work yourself into being in crowds again. Because people that already had anxiety and then put this on top of it, they're going to have some panic moments like that, where they walk into places and it's going to be way too overwhelming. And to pay attention to those feelings and maybe back out and not do things. Don't jump into the water. Let's put a toe in and see how that feels. You don't have to just immediately reintegrate yourself into everything. that is actually kind of dangerous.
Well, and I think that's a crucial point for us, is that we need some sort of transitional liminal space we need to create. And I think, maybe as a Vikings fan, you may be a professional at dealing with grief because of their loss record. But for the rest of us that are, as we continue through this, you've mentioned this, this powerful word, which is grief, and that people deal with this differently. And so, both of you, as you practice your work, when you're doing therapy sessions and you're walking through, what are some things that we should keep in mind about how people process grief? Because I have seen, just basic human behaviors, we tend to imprint what we think works on, other people. And so when it comes to grief, this is not something we're used to talking about a lot. And now we are. And how do we make room for both adolescent brains and adult brains to process this healthily as we continue to move forward?
The analogy that I've always used for grief with people, I actually came across on Twitter one day, and it's been a life changer for me. It talk about a grief box. So if you think about grief as a box, and then there's a button inside the box, it's called your grief button. And then there's when you have grief, the ball inside the box is big. And the more closer you are to the grief, the sooner that it is like in proximity. When something big happens, that ball is really big. And so it's hitting that grief button all of the time. And as time goes on, or you start to manage your emotions, or you just kind of, find ways to move on from the grief that happened, that ball might get smaller. But when it hits that grief button, it still hurts just as much as it did when the ball was big. It just isn't hitting it as frequently. It's hitting it less frequently and less intensely, but it's still there. And so if you look at all of your major grief moments in your life as these balls that kind of live in your grief box, and when it hits it, it hurts. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It means that you're pretty human, and that's kind of what's going to happen. And right now, everybody's grief ball is kind of big because we're still in a pandemic, coming out of it maybe, but still in it. And so that button is being hit pretty frequently. And how to manage that is, through talking, communication, journaling. There's all sorts of different things that people find helpful to deal with the grief that happens. But it helps to people conceptualize it, because a lot of times people be like, it comes out of nowhere. Like, I think I'm fine. And then something happens, and it hurts just like it did before. What's wrong with me? Well, there's nothing wrong with you, man. You're human, and that's okay. Let's figure out how to manage that when it does come up.
Grief is a really interesting experience because there's a lot of emotions that, like, if I'm at work and I get annoyed with something, I can push that down, and that's not necessarily unhealthy, but it'll go away. Like, I can make that go away and just be fine. Grief doesn't go away. It will be stored, and then it might ooze out in different ways, and might come out, especially with kids, and especially with boys, comes out as anger, might come out as irritability, might come out as anxiousness. And I say that that's it coming out sideways. And the biggest thing that I tell people is the only right way to grieve is to just grieve. And so whatever that means for you, that's what you have to do. And I will help you figure out what we got to do to make that happen. But we just got to figure out what that exactly means for you. There's not necessarily a perfect textbook way to do it. It's just that you need to do it. Another analogy similar to the grief button that I like to talk about is grief is kind of like a wet sponge. I use this for my kids, who I call stuffers, who like to stuff down their feelings. If you stuff a wet sponge into a box and you put it away, the water doesn't go away necessarily. It just makes the sponge smell gross and get all moldy. And we don't want to be moldy. So we gotta squeeze out the sponge, which means that we're gonna get wet, which means that we might cry, which means that we might feel gross at the time, but we need to get it out. And by squeezing it and allowing it to get everywhere for just a minute, the sponge gets a little bit drier, and then we feel a little bit better.
Well, go ahead, Christy.
Well, I think when we talk about grief, a lot of people think about grief only in terms of death. And I think that's been different for people to wrap their heads around too. Grief is not just in death. Grief is the loss of anything. It's the loss of a basketball season. It's a loss of a graduation. It's a loss of a prom. It's the loss of a job. It's a loss of any kind. You go through the cycles of grief, and it's not linear. You think denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Those are the 5 stages of grief. And people are like, okay, now this is where I am, and so I'm really getting close to acceptance. But you don't. I mean, you can bounce between those all of the time. It's not a linear process, and it's not just about death.
Well, I think, so you two correct me if this synopsis is wrong, but there's a couple of really key takeaways I do want to highlight for our viewers, which is the body remembers things that the brain doesn't. And that emotions are going to continue to come up, especially with young minds and what we've gone through. And this is a long-term situation that we're all in for, to try to process this healthy. And some of the best ways to do that is both modeling by doing it ourselves as adults, but also working with them to process these emotions. It seems like the real opportunity that we have here, maybe collectively, is to get better at processing emotions, communicating them, not to make it unhealthy where we're wallowing, but to move on healthily. It can cause a lot of problems. We have a moldy sponge, as Lucas says, if we don't pull that up and to deal with it. So as we move towards closing this webinar, we've got a few minutes left, but Christy, let's start with you. Additional thoughts you'd like to share with our viewers?
When we talk about the body remembering things that the brain can't connect, the olfactory sense, your sense of smell, is probably one of the strongest ones of that. And the best thing I can get people to even think about or understand is, if you had a boyfriend that wore a cologne in high school or whatever, and you're going through the mall and you can smell it on somebody, and all of a sudden your body goes, oh my God, why is that feeling coming over me? It's usually because there's a sense of smell that comes back, and it kind of brings your whole body back to where you were at that time. And so that's likely to happen with a pandemic, when you're talking about, moving forward and things that, the smell of sanitizer, that kind of thing. But your olfactory sense is really huge. And also not thinking that emotions are bad, which kind of goes back to that don't, can't, shouldn't sort of thing. But there's a lot of times where people will say, he's just so angry, and they talk about it like it's such a bad thing. And anger is not bad. Anger is a feeling that everybody has, and it's typically a secondary emotion. Anger is very rarely the emotion that somebody's feeling, but anger gives people the illusion of being in control. It's easy. It's a default emotion, because feeling shame, guilt, embarrassment, all that stuff, they're icky. They're not fun to feel. And anger kind of gives people this like powerful feeling, or it gives them a sense of control over what's happening. And that's really not what it is. And so if you've got kids that are angry or irritable, it's likely that there's really something else going on underneath of there. And so to not shame kids because they're angry is so hard, because they're probably doing naughty things. And it's not that there can't be consequences for behavior. That's not what I'm saying. But there is some understanding that has to come with when you see kids that just feel angry or irritable, like what's going on underneath it there? What are the other emotions? Because what we've also seen is that, I don't know if you know this, but I think it's been stressful for parents in 2020. I mean, I've heard that it's been kind of a stressful year. I'm a therapist, and so I can make those kind of judgments. And what we're seeing from kids is that they can see that in their parents. They can tell that their parents are overwhelmed. They can tell when their parents are irritable or just kind of not in a good space. And so sometimes kids won't express what they're feeling because they don't want to make things harder on their parent that they already know is going through a hard time. And so I think that goes back to the importance of saying, I know, hey buddy, I know that I'm not in a good mood. It has nothing to do with you. I want to do a check-in. Do check-ins with your kids. That's a really easy way to do it too. You have just like 15 minutes here or there. You're like, hey, I need a check-in, so I want to know how you're doing too, and showing some really care and concern for where they're at, while also saying where you are, so they can understand that that's not their fault. Because a lot of times kids will think it's their fault, especially when it comes to homeschooling, which hopefully we're on the other end of that now. But kids take a lot of responsibility for the feelings of their parents. and that gets to be tough.
Well, that's so powerful. I think you've given us something very practical there too, which is a check-in for us feeling emotion or seeing, as Lucas mentioned earlier, when you're kind of witnessing these behaviors and, is let's have a check-in. That's a great solution for us to do now and continuously. Well, Lucas, additional thoughts that you'd like to share with our viewers?
Yeah, I think that during the pandemic, during the quarantine, there was a lot of focus on self-care, a lot of focus on taking care of yourself and doing things that you enjoy, to make sure that your mental health is in check, that you're just doing well. I've noticed that as we've kind of start to like get on the tail end of this, hopefully, that people are kind of pulling back on that and not necessarily continuing to do those things. And so we do need to continue to practice self-care, and doing things that you enjoy. Spending time outside in the sun, being with people, eating healthy, exercising, going to the doctor when you don't feel well, getting appropriate amount of sleep. Another thing that I get asked quite a bit, especially outside of the office, obviously, is, do you think I need therapy? And if you're asking the question, yes. But therapy is really great for a lot of people just to come in every now and again and do check-ins. It doesn't have to be that you have this monstrous trauma that you have to come in and process with, or you're having these huge explosive outbursts, or your whole world is falling apart. Therapy is about just helping you make sense of what's going on. You have feelings that are happening, stressful events are going on, and just talking through that with somebody who is objective, who doesn't have any stake in the game, and is just there to listen. And so I would encourage anybody who's even contemplating therapy to just give it a shot. And if you find that the person's not necessarily your personality that you fit with, go try another one. Therapy shopping is a real thing. And Christy and I will tell our people all the time when we first meet, that's fine. If we're not a good match, which, I mean, we always are, but if we're not a good match, we can help you find somebody else that would be. And I just think that that's really important to remember, that as we get into hopefully back to normal, that we continue to do these habits that we've developed, and continue to, as Christy was saying, just be kind to yourself and be patient with yourself and your kids. And this has been a process. This has been a long journey, and hopefully we're at the tail end of it. But it doesn't just stop. We don't stop talking about mental health. We don't stop talking about these things. We keep doing check-ins. We keep taking care of ourselves, so that we can continue to thrive.
I think it's important to note too, that this generation of kids, the Gen Zers, who think I need to have a middle part and not skinny jeans, whatever, I'm over it, but it's fine. They're accessing mental health services in greater quantities than any generation before them. And I think, we could talk a lot about how social media is not great, but there's a lot of good things that have come out of social media. And one of them is people sharing their own mental health stories and kids not feeling like they're alone. And that therapy is actually kind of cool. And it's not this terrible thing, or it means that there's something like wrong with you or bad with you. And I think the point that I want to make sure to get home is that my generation, the generation before me, if you had to go to therapy, there was something wrong with you. So if you've got your kid that's coming to you and saying, hey, I think I want to go to therapy, I think that's an okay thing, to not let your own bias and your own experience from when we were growing up get in the way of getting your kids services. I would say 9 times out of 10, I'll get a kid that comes in and I'll meet with the parent and I'll talk to them about what's going on with their kid. And the parent will be like, is it possible that I have that too? Is that like a thing that I might have? Because that sounds a lot like me. And so it's kind of a way for them to get themselves services through getting them with their kids. But the Gen Zers, that stigma is getting lifted pretty quickly, which is really awesome to see. And I just don't want, you get a lot of kids will be like, I've told my mom that I need to go to therapy and they won't let me go, or they say that I don't need it and that I'm just fine. So if your kid's coming to you and saying that that's something that they want to try out, like, listen to them. There's nothing wrong with that. We get a lot of kids that come in just because they're not like super mentally ill by any, and that's not really what therapy is for. It's It's just a place you can come for figure out ways to help manage your thoughts and be a little less anxious or less depressed or whatever that is. So just don't discourage it. And if your kid comes to them, see if you can find a way to make that happen for them.
Well, and I think you've laid that out so well too, that if we don't deal with those emotions, then they become behaviors that can be destructive. And so I think that's an incredibly important thing to end on. You two have shared with us the status of mental health, what has happened at the beginning of this pandemic, what's happened currently, and the long-term impacts of this. You've helped us to give us some real staples for what's happening inside of the brain and how we process things and what's happening in the adolescent mind, and also the core things that we can do as adults. And you've given us steps like, creating a check-in, processing feelings together, helping your children to create some space where they can make their own decisions and move forward. This has been so illuminating and impactful. And before we close, because you two have such a wealth of this knowledge, after hearing my summary, I'd like you both just to share just a parting thoughts. So Lucas, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I just thank you for having us here. I want to just echo again that if you or someone is struggling and needs to come in and talk, just call somebody. There's lots of different services in town and lots of different services across the country. Just reach out and get some help.
And Christy.
Yeah, I love that you've invited us here. I think it's important for people to know really the impacts, that there are reasons for why they're feeling what they're feeling, and that you're not crazy. I think that's a big thing, or that to not think that people have to suffer through it just because everybody else is going through it, so I can just get through it too. Everybody experiences things differently. Everybody does. And so just because your buddy might not be having a bad time, getting through the pandemic, doesn't mean that it should be easy for you either. And I think there's a lot of judgment in that way, mostly of ourselves. Most people don't judge other people. We get more judgy of ourselves. But just because you're experiencing it different than other people doesn't mean that it's wrong or bad. It just means that it's the way that you're experiencing it, and that's okay. But if it gets to the point where you're not able to function in your daily life, or there are things that you're forgetting or you're missing, or you're just kind of feeling like you're not right, it's okay. But there's also help for you to feel better.
Well, I want to thank you both for illuminating the path for all of us that have had the opportunity to watch this live and later in the recording, that you've given us a path towards a brighter tomorrow. And so we can recognize what's happening today, and we now have an outlook, and we've got some tools of what to do moving forward. So Christy, Lucas, thank you so much for joining us today. Everybody, we want to thank you for tuning in and watching this today. And a special thank you to Christy and Lucas for sharing how we can use the lessons of the pandemic to prioritize and support youth mental health. Just a phenomenal, wealth of information and resources from those two today. Join us right here for our next live stream. It's going to be The Truth About Vaping. Now that's June 16th at noon. And Fargo Cast Public Health, Melissa's Markegard, will share what you need to know about vaping to dispel some common myths and steer youth away from e-cigarettes and other tobacco products. So you're not going to want to miss that one. Check out our social channels as well for more information about that and other resources. Want to thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.